We are YIMBY Melbourne. You've probably seen us around the place. We're a grassroots non-profit, member-driven, and we're advocating for a bigger, better city. Our tagline is fighting for housing abundance. That means more homes where people want to live and more homes around Melbourne and a bigger, better Melbourne because we love this city and we love it so much that we want to share it. So, we've got our biggest event yet, and it's about parking. We are, of course, about providing a positive voice, a voice for more development, but a voice for better development. And one of the big things holding back good development in this city, which we're going to, of course, talk about tonight, is legislation around parking. Parking minimums, requirements to oversupply parking and induce demand. And these are having, effects on housing prices to the tunes of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. We'll be talking about that later as well, and you can read more about it in YIMBY Melbourne's Missing Middle Report, which we put out last year. But today, it's not about us, it's not about YIMBY Melbourne, it is about who we're honoured to be hosting, Mr. Dr. David Mepham. There's an appetite for urban reform in this city, and having David fortuitously be launching his new book with Routledge, Rethinking Parking, it's really well timed because we're at a moment now where the Victorian government is rethinking everything. They're rethinking how we do development in the city, where that development happens, who it's for, and what the composition and what kinds of housing we want in the future. And a lot of that is tied to road use, car use, and parking. So there's no better time to rethink parking. I know there's many people in the room here who have a stake in this, be it as renters, be it as prospective homeowners, be it as councillors, members of government, and thank you all very much for being here. This is a talk to take seriously, and this is a talk to bring to future reform. David, of course, is a doctor. He has been a planner for many years. He's familiar with the hallways and the mazes of Trades Hall, and I think it's fair to say that there is no larger blight on good land use in this city than parking. And so, folks, stop your engines, park your butts down, and welcome David Mepham.
Thank you, and I've got to say it's a great honour to be here because I organised a few events, and this can be contrasted with my event in Adelaide, which nobody RSVP'd for, so you can imagine I was quite disappointed with, and it's not quite my hometown, but it is actually it's my local city. So I'm really, really excited to be able to talk to people who care about their city, and I love Melbourne. I lived here for several years. And to some extent, Melbourne actually did inspire me to write this book, and some of the people that I've met and talked to and complained to about planning and parking. I've got to stand on the spot apparently because there is a camera right there. Thank you. Yeah. All right. So just let me know when I wander too far off the mark. So I'll keep an eye also on the screen because I've got to remember where I am. So can we just go to the next slide? And I'm on 20 minutes. I'm relying on Jonathan to keep me on time. So when I started writing the book, there's a guy called Donald Shoup, who I'm sure quite a few of you are familiar with. So Donald's if you like, the godfather of parking. The guy was writing about it for years and years and years. No one really cared. And when I met to meet him, and he says, so you're writing a book on parking, you realise nobody cares about parking. And I'm thinking, well, of course they don't, I do, but most people don't. But he did say, people don't care about parking, but they do care about the things that parking impacts. And critically, parking, as we all know, uses an incredible amount of space in the urban area, even though sometimes we're quite oblivious to the impact of parking. But I think if there'll be a few planners and elected members here amongst us who actually do get out of their car and see, or their bike, and see how much space is dedicated to parking, and maybe even starting to think about how much money we expend on parking without even realising. Not personally, but governments expend. And a lot of that expenditure on parking is actually in the form of subsidies. And I've argued with people that a city like Melbourne has literally billions of dollars tied up in parking and they're not even aware of it. And I've spent the last few years trying to find out, for example, how much park and ride is there in Melbourne? What is the value of that park and ride? What is the subsidy for the park and ride? Bearing in mind it's free. And who's paying for that? Now, I can answer the last question really easily. You're paying for it. Why? I've got no idea. All right. The other thing I'm not sure of is exactly how much park and ride there is, or exactly how much free public parking there is in the city. It's quite interesting that there's so little data on one of these critical questions about public expenditure. There are, of course, other impacts. So if you're walking through Melbourne, as I did this afternoon, you might walk for a minute, wait for a minute. What are you waiting for? This is parking-related traffic. You're waiting for someone on that road who's looking for parking. We tend not to think about that, but parking impacts the form and the functionality of the city. It creates congestion, it creates inconvenience, and it's a barrier to accessible and inclusive places. Most of the time, we don't realise that, we don't see it. If there's like a psychological test where people pass a ball around in a group, and then you ask them, well, how many times the ball was passed? And they say, oh, it was 15. You got exactly right. Did you see the gorilla that walked across the stage? And people went, no, that's parking, right? It's right in front of us. You cannot miss it, except that we do, because we're more obsessed with other things. The only time we really notice parking is actually when we want to park our car. And that particular view of parking is a view of parking from the driver's seat. And that view is the view that has decided 100 years of parking policy. So, whoever's doing the slide. So, when I started to unpack my sort of crazy 100 ideas about parking, I thought I really need to try and structure this, rather than just sort of assault you with 100 unrelated ideas. And I sort of came down to 5 perspectives. So at the centre of the perspective, the key issue for me is that parking must be about place. It cannot be about driver convenience. If you give drivers all the parking they want, you will end up with a place that is not worth visiting. Okay, now Melbourne is a city with lots of great places. I always say Sydney's got a harbour and the Opera House. Who cares? Melbourne's got places, and they're great places, and you can get around, you can cycle and use transit. Place is critical, and probably even now more critical than ever. I mean, you've got these places that really thrive on the consumption of leisure. People gather and socialise and meet each other in these places. These great places that entertain the money out of our pockets and employ us and amuse us, they are compromised by this insane demand like an insatiable demand for more and more parking. But unfortunately, as drivers, we are the last person to realise how crazy that is. So I ask people, get out of your car, step back from your car and look and see the parking and see the impact that has on place. So I think there are 4 key ideas here that I'd like to quickly unpack, just to sort of give you maybe a different view of parking. And I know to some extent I'm preaching to the converted, so you'll just have to forgive me for that. But the first one is about politics. Now, I happened to meet a couple of people here earlier on that are involved in council or interested in running for council. And I've been an elected member myself, so I appreciate parking is just nuts. You don't go there, it's crazy. If you want to get unelected, start talking about parking. Because you'll have the Chamber of Commerce come down on you like a ton of bricks in no time flat, all right? But we need to find a way of talking about parking. We need to sort of, find a way through this. And I think the first thing we need to understand is that most of the time, the discussion around parking is actually not rational at all. It's very emotional. I think that somewhere in the back of our human brain is this sort of reptilian thing about territory, and I think it's no accident that humans' obsession with territory has led to us being the sort of apex species, and it's no accident that a lot of people sort of find that their most unpleasant social interaction of the day might have happened in the car park, because that person who cuts you off is definitely not on your Christmas card list. But people get very angry and upset about parking, and that's what we have to deal with. So we're talking to the public, we're talking to traders, we're talking to other councillors and people in the community. People get crazy about parking, so we need to find a way around that. And I think one of the things I'd like to expand on with this audience is the idea of governance structures, and actually starting to think about what is the role that the state might play in getting local government a little bit out of the firing line on parking, so that we can have these intelligent, reasonable, rational discussions. And on that point, I note from talking to Jonathan that you actually have a lot of this work done. I mean, there's a lot of people writing this policy. It's terrific policy, and the stuff from Infrastructure Victoria is great. We need to get from the idea to the outcome, and there's quite a few obstacles on that pathway. And that issue of policy is also sort of encumbered by the fact that parking is a very sort of me, here, now thing. When you're in your car, and I drive, I am not some like exceptionally green, enlightened person. I am that annoying, angry, impatient driver, right? I get that. But we need to think beyond the me, here, now and think about the way in which parking intersects critically with a whole range of other policy issues, and critically, the issue of affordable housing. And that's something I'd hope to talk about a little bit more today, because parking adds a huge cost to affordable housing. It's a huge barrier. And I would say to people that if you brought Bob Menzies back right here on the stage now and showed him a parking policy from your council, he would recognise it, all right? It would be a policy that was basically written in the mid-20th century, that was cut and pasted from the United States, and we hang on to this, we cling to this. You know what's happening in the United States? They're moving on. They're moving on. Australia is kind of stuck here with these ideas, while the rest of the world, including the people who gave us the damn policy in the first place, have moved on. So there's a lot of work to happen around this. The issue of pricing is really important. And as I had a session at lunchtime today, and someone raised an issue I hadn't even really thought about, which is about, banks don't want to lend money to developers who do low to no parking. And I thought, oh, that's really worth unpacking. But there's a more immediate issue here in my mind, and that is that we still have this idea, this ludicrous idea, that parking is free. Now, anyone who's read anything about Donald Shoup, they know parking is not free. But even if it's not actually free, it might still be cheap. It might still be subsidised. The question you have to ask yourself is, who's paying for my parking? So if I park for free or cheaply around the city, or even, incredibly, the amount of park and ride space in the city that's dedicated to often white-collar, middle-class workers coming to the CBD to their $100,000 a year plus jobs, having their parking subsidised by other people. God forbid we question that. It's almost sacrosanct to question stuff like park and ride, but I think we have to start thinking about that and questioning it. And I am no different from anyone else. If I can get a free car park, I am like George Costanza. I'm thinking, wow, I'm great. But this is a nuts policy. It's absolutely crazy. So if you're getting a cheap car park, you need to ask who's paying for it. And as I spoke to someone this morning about the Prahran Square car park, and I said, this is a $50 million car park, right? Each car park is worth about $100,000. It's half full, even on a rainy day. Right, Prahran is one of the suburbs in Melbourne that actually has one of the highest levels of walk to work, cycle, and also like low car households. They're paying for their car parking. God forbid, why? Why are we doing this? It is insane. Everything about this is nuts. But it's because we just sort of caught in this way of thinking about parking that we just keep on doing what we're doing, and somehow we think somehow we're winning, but we're almost certainly not winning. It's holding back a whole bunch of other opportunities. And I would say that when every dollar that subsidises parking is looted from another budget, and that budget might be DDA access down to Melbourne stations, and God forbid there's a lot of those stations that do not have that access. Cycling, safe cycling lanes, better footpaths. And even as I was in Prahran, and I was walking down the footpath, and I'm just thinking, when are they going to fix this damn footpath? And of course there's no money to fix footpaths. Why not? Well, work it out. Who spent all the money on parking? The fourth point, which might interest some of you here, is the issue of professional practice. My thinking is that as drivers, viewing parking from the driver's seat has significantly shaped the way in which we fix parking. And we fix it as transport planners. We view parking as the end point in the transport planning equation. Now, before I kind of really got interested in parking, I was working on urban transit, so I was managed on the Gold Coast Light Rail. And I started to sort of think, what are we doing here? How are we resolving, getting the right route? Some people wanted to build the light rail at the back over here, we're just connecting up a series of car parks, and there was a bunch of people in council who really wanted to go through Surfers Paradise and Southport. So we really started to unpack that. And I realised that the very first thing that we'd done correctly was completely accidental. We had accidentally made a decision many, many years earlier that put transport planners in the same department as land use planners. We actually knew each other. We were talking to each other. We were having a dialogue. So if you go, and then I was later on seconded into the Department of Transport, and I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. It was such a silo, like this absolutely impermeable silos. So the governance issues are really important. So it overlaps into politics. But as professional planners, we actually need to work out how to collaborate and develop these integrated solutions. And that is absolutely critical for good transit planning outcomes, but I would argue it's equally critical for developing smarter, more equitable, more efficient parking outcomes. So we'll just go to the next slide. So I'll just quickly touch on this. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Project for Public Spaces. I've always loved their work, I always find it really engaging. But I just want to say one thing about this, is that parking sits just down the bottom there between 6 and 7 on the outside. And I think it's fascinating to me that we sort of allowed the parking to it's become some sort of little thing there, like a little marginal thing. Parking is like cancer, mate. Once it gets into the system, it takes over the whole system, all right? So I actually think even the people I really deeply respect that do place planning actually might need to rethink parking themselves. So let's go to the next slide. So I apologise in advance that this slide is very dense with information, but I use this in the book and I use it to organise the ideas. And we go to the next slide. So I break this up. So just talking about, and this is not quite translated perfectly, but you can see here below the line, so this is all about the place, all right? This is about places worth going to. So you can have parking, you can have all the parking you like, right? People can't get enough car parking, but you can't have all of that parking and have places worth going to. You've got to step back, you've got to concede something here. So if you do actually have all the parking you want, you're going to end up with these weak destinations that attract drivers only because they've got cheap, easy parking, right? Alternatively, you can create these stronger destinations that attract drivers to places worth visiting. Is parking free? I very seriously doubt it. Like, you're going to have to pay for what you use. But in that equation there's a whole bunch of things that are happening. So I think getting from that driver focus, that parking first, that parking on top. I talk about path over place. Being a planner who's worked in transport planning, the planner in me is completely obsessed with the place quality. The transport planner in me is talking, the path is really important. But what happens is that the path actually starts to subordinate the place. If you're not careful, it's all about the path. And you see that with the way in which freeways come right into the city and completely overrun everything else in its path. So a way forward is really to think about the destination first, to think not just about the place, but how you actually move around that place. And walking is absolutely critical, and walking and rolling and cycling, and to being able to accommodate those things. Now, earlier on I was talking about walking in Melbourne and spending so much time waiting to cross the road. And the reason for that is because we've allowed parking to come right into the centre of the city. So you get a whole bunch of white-collar workers who've got to park within 1 minute of where they work, or else it's the end of the planet, If I get the train into the city, I get off at Flinders Street and I walk. That's what people do. That's what people have done for the last couple of 100 years. Somehow when you're in your car, you're entitled to some special sort of access. So we've got this idea, this sense of entitlement, that we actually must be able to park in the Rockstar car park, in the building or at the front of the building. And I think that has become highly problematic, because it's not just the parking, it's not just the space, it's not just the cost, it's actually all of those amenity issues that cars bring into the city. And I suggest that in the future, that good parking outcome the car parks will be outside the city, and the city itself will be dedicated to walking and rolling, and it'll be completely safe. And we will find that we've got a whole bunch of new space, which is called that space where we park our car on the side of the road, which will have trees and landscaping and seating and a whole bunch of new activities happening in the city that make that walk great, all right? Because there are still places, still streets in Melbourne that are not offering that really good walking experience. Now, I'm going to be mindful of the time because Jonathan will be beating up on me soon. So I'm going to just sort of race through this quickly, and I have, we'll go to the next slide. I have touched on some of these things, but I will touch a little bit more on the politics, and hopefully in the discussion here, we'll start to sort of unpack that a little bit. Because parking is primarily a responsibility of local government. The local governments are just getting destroyed by parking. On one hand, you've got trader groups screaming blue murder. In fact, I believe in Melbourne, someone at Yarraville got punched in the face at a council meeting by a trader or someone over parking. And I think, we're just going nuts. We're crazy about it. We've got to create some space for local government to make good decisions. All right, and I know the state government can kick back and go, no, there's no problem here. There is a problem, and the state government must step up. And I'll use very quickly a couple of examples. In the United States, which we normally think, oh, they're so sort of passé, they're so stuck in the dark ages, they're miles in front of us on parking, absolutely miles in front of us. And one of the critical ways they're in front of us is around governance. So in both California, like 50 million people in California and in Oregon, smaller state, the state government has come in and basically said, there's no more minimum rates, right? That's gone, that's history. From now on, if you want one car per unit, that is the maximum, not the minimum. And developers are starting to sort of get their head around that. But having the state government giving them that protection has actually meant, so when you're an elected member, you go to your community, people are going nuts about parking. Oh no, state, it's terrible. You can pass the buck, and that makes life a lot easier for councils because at the moment, in a city like Melbourne, lots of small councils, they are just picking one council off after another. And I would argue that what's happened over a long period of time is that the auto industry is so deeply embedded in our media because they sell it's a huge amount of money on advertising for vehicles. It's actually very, very hard to get the media on side with councils about making these quite sensible decisions about parking. The state government can do that. It's going to be a lot less bruising for them, and it gives the councils much, much more leeway to make sensible decisions. We just go to the next slide, because those decisions are really policy decisions. So what I'm looking for is a couple of points I'll raise quickly. We've been talking about parking for quite a long time. And people will think, well, we've been banging on about this for 20 years. And I'm going, yes, but we've got the technology, okay? We've got parking technologies that are now super cheap. You can put pods in the ground. You can measure how much a car park is being used. You can set a price according to the level of demand. So you see the stuff that Shoop's doing with demand responsive pricing. That is huge in San Francisco now. It's really working in Los Angeles. Increasingly, you're seeing other cities pick up on these very, very sensible policy ideas that are related to pricing, which is the next issue. But the technology has never really been that accessible before. So we've always had the need. Now we have the technology to address that need. And the other issue is around shared mobility, which is really taking off as well. On the issue of price, I've touched on a fair bit of this, but I'll just quickly touch on the issue of demand responsive pricing because I think this is such an important thing. It is so elegant. When I was talking to Don Shoop, I'm thinking, you've invented something that's like poetry to me, all right? Because it was just such a simple idea that you could actually set the price of a car park according to demand. And then people are coming in with a technology that actually enables you to really give effect to that. But then what he did was invent this idea of parking benefit districts. And this is the clincher. So you're in local government, you go down and meet with the traders, they're beating up on you, and then you say, well, hang on a sec, we're going to share this revenue, all right? All these projects you've been squabbling about for ages, you cannot organise yourself to fund them. Parking can pay for those projects. So when I was in Portland, I met with Tony Jordan, he's the head of Parking Reform Network, and I urge you to think about joining that, and eventually we'll have one in Australia. We went up to 21st and 23rd Street. So these people have been fighting amongst themselves for absolutely ages. When we presented this stuff around demand responsive pricing and parking benefit districts, they're like, hang on a sec, this, and pretty quickly they actually started to bring them on board. They had the money to do some really good research, and it wasn't just about having a meeting and who could make the most noise. They really did some really good detailed research and talked to people about why do you come to this place, what do you want to do. Parking's on the list, sure, but it's not at the top of the list. They're not going there for parking, they were going there because it was a great place. So those sorts of, those learnings from price are absolutely critical. And just on the last slide, I'll just probably reiterate this issue around transport planners and urban planners. Let's get out of these contrived silos, all right? Parking effectively sits at the junction of those two ideas. It is a transport issue, but it's not only a transport issue. It is a land use issue, but it's not only a land use issue. We can resolve the issue of parking in the juncture between those two professions, and in that space we learn to collaborate and innovate and create great parking solutions. And I think I'm pretty close to the end, but there is a slide I think I included on this version that we can go to. This is where the United States are. These are the cities in the United States that are undertaking serious reform, and it might be, you can see on the bottom corner here, you've got some Main Street stuff that's not really that evident at this scale, some transit-oriented development, some city centre. We like to think, oh, Australia's so progressive, we're so out there, we are not. On parking, we are the laggards here. We've got a lot of catching up to do. Now, I think the critical way forward, as I've discussed, is going to be some stuff around local governments getting their act together on pricing. It's going to be state government getting their act together on reform. And even the federal government, for God's sake, stop insulting us with these hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies for parking rights so you can win an election. All right? Every role of government, every level of government has a role to play in this. But I hope in 10 years' time, maybe Australia, I might not be too embarrassed, I could put a map up of Australia and not feel humiliated about the fact there's almost nothing on it, all right? So there's a lot of work to do, and I know I'm looking at a lot of people here who are going to be involved in that. So thank you for coming, and I hope you've got some good questions as well out of this. There might possibly be one more slide. Let's have a quick look. Okay, this is actually US and Canadian cities that have repealed parking mandates. All right, and you can see almost every year it's just going and growing and growing. So, and just see if there's any more slides, because I lose track of this. All right, I think we have covered a fair bit of that. All right, I've covered minimum rates, new technologies, transparency. Any more slides? One after that? There you go, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, David. Give a round of applause once again to David. And you did a pretty good job sticking to time, I will say.
Honestly, I'm so time challenged. I would have just kept talking. I had to sort of quite keep an eye out for some cues from other people, and they're going,
Nah, you did a great job. Hey, look, I wanted to ask you a question on sort of a personal level. Everyone who comes to YIMBY Melbourne, who finds us, has a kind of origin story. A lot of people get into housing via sort of an extendedly visceral reaction to cars and parking. A lot of people end up kind of thinking about urbanism when, they start trying to ride places or, move around in a way that isn't kind of just a private automobile. I guess I wanted to ask you, what brought you to parking as kind of your focus? Like, what was the thing? Was there a moment? Was there an event in your life where you were traumatized by a car park?
It's funny you should use the word traumatised, because when I was on the light rail projects, I was a manager for light rail, and the very first thing I decided that this cannot ever be a transport project. It had to be a city building project. If you go to the Gold Coast, light rail runs right through Surfers Paradise, Southport, and we fought a lot of battles for that. And my thinking was evolving out of that, because we had to remove a lot of car parking to get the transit through that corridor. And car parking was a barrier and almost a killer for the Gold Coast Light Rail, and it actually was a killer for 3 different Brisbane light rail projects. It killed them. Okay, so if people were just clinging so tightly to their parking. They get so emotional, and so I was really aware of it, and I was talking about it to a lot of people about how we deal with parking, and also how we communicate with our people in the corridor about parking. And my manager at the time and we had some very, very serious disagreements, and I feel like when the project finished and he said, well, if you like parking so much, why don't you write a new parking policy? And I'm pretty confident that that was not meant to be a compliment. What he did give me, though, was the time to really do the work on it, because there was a very, very good chance that council were never, ever going to agree to the sort of policy that I've been talking about. And we did the work, and I managed, the mayor, to his credit, actually disappeared as the vote was being taken, and allowed the vote to go through as a unanimous vote. And that sort of was part of that entree into parking.
Yeah, wonderful. So your entrance story is actually a success story, which...
Yeah, but I think I'm pretty sure I was being set up to fail. My determination to not fail prevailed, so yeah.
Well, and we're all the better for it. In Alan Kohler's recent quarterly essay, which you all should read because I'm in it. You should all read it. It's quite good. It's called The Great Divide, and he talks about homeowners as Australia's kind of biggest special interest lobby group, an interest lobby group that in turn kind of gets a bunch of tax and policy carve-outs that suit them. But it sort of struck me, reading your Melbourne chapter of the book, is that there's actually a bigger special interest group in a way, which is car owners, because even renters tend to own cars. In fact, sometimes it's important or more essential for renters to own cars because they need the flexibility if they're forced to move more regularly. You quote Liz Taylor in the book that in Melbourne, Australia, sorry to not quote you to yourself, by the way, Liz Taylor says, in Melbourne, Australia, 95% of parking trips over 2012 to 2014 were free for the user. Unlike food or housing, parking tends to be considered public infrastructure or a right rather than a market good, which of course speaks to your kind of demand-driven pricing policies. How do we overcome politically the sort of mother of all free rider problems?
Right. Well, actually, Liz came to my lunchtime presentation. I always feel a bit guilty because Liz has done so much work on this, and to some extent she deserves much, much more credit than she gets for the work that she does. So I was happy to quote what I thought was a really important thing. I feel, of course, if you can park easily and cheaply, of course you're going to drive. If you're forced to buy a unit that's got a car park in it, you've already paid for the car parking. The car is almost like a rounding error on your cost. We're actually really pulling people into these car-oriented lifestyles almost inadvertently. Like we find ourselves, with a garage and then a car, and then we build up this sort of dependency. And also just the idea that we're building so much of our housing out on the fringe rather than utilising all these land assets in the city. And I'll just say very, very quickly, one of my case studies is in Toronto, and the Toronto Council, the mayor was quite progressive, and he's thinking, we've got so much land here that's just dedicated to parking, it's just not on the books. So he set up a real estate company within council, and all of the property assets went under their management. And then they started evaluating all the land they had, and then that was the land that became available for affordable housing. It wasn't on the books before. It was never going to be sold, right? It was never going to be in the market. And very, very quickly, they actually built, in a factory, they built these 57 prefab units, dropped them into a car park, and provided housing for people, like older people at risk of homelessness. So, the cheap housing with the whole car dependency thing's being built in, but it's actually being built in outside. My issue is about offering people an opportunity to live in the city and not to have to worry about also then paying for a car. So I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, it absolutely does, and actually leads quite nicely into my last question. I'm going to ask this question, and then we'll be opening up to the floor, because I know there are a lot of people who will have questions. And then after that, the bar will be open, and we'll be networking, and there'll be the room through the back. So that's how the rest of this is going to go. But I do have one last question that leads on very nicely from there, and also allows us to spruik once again our Melbourne's Missing Middle report, where we called for the abolition of parking minimums, as you call for also. Parking minimums, for those of you in the room, and thanks to work I believe done by Mary Beck Council, of whom there are representatives here, parking minimums add about $100,000 in cost to every 3-bedroom apartment within Melbourne that's built here. So when you build a dwelling that has up to 2 bedrooms, you only need to provide 1 car park. But when you build a dwelling that is more than 2 bedrooms, so a family-sized home, you are required to provide 2 car parks. Now, car parks cost in a residential development up to around about $56,000, give or take. So you're looking at a 6-figure addition to the cost of the home for 2 cars that, you know, people potentially won't have. And that makes it kind of unviable to build family apartments. And so when people say, why don't we have family apartments? Parking is a huge part of that. And it's a hidden cost, as you've talked about tonight. What are some other hidden costs of parking that you think would shock people?
Before I got into transport planning, I was actually involved in social planning. And I was setting up community transport schemes for Brisbane City Council. And in fact, Jim Sawley, who was the mayor of Brisbane, when he left after 11 years, and he was asked, what was your most significant improvement? And he actually named community transport, which was great. And what I was really interested in that is that we were an ageing community, but we seem to be doing, we talk a lot about affordable housing and ageing, but I don't think we're really doing that much about it. So my issue is about when you're pushing people into parking, assume some sort of ability to drive. Now, you know, when my father gets into the car, like, that is a very, very scary thing, all right? But he hasn't got any choice. Right? He's living in a place where it's completely car dependent. You've got a whole generation of people, not dissimilar from my age, who moved out into the suburbs in the 70s and the 80s, made their families out there. Those people are now in their 70s and 80s. They can't drive. They can't, if they can drive, they can't drive easily or safely. So we've built in car dependency. So I think we were talking about like this, just locking in minimum rates ignores all of those issues. You know, all the people, and we talk about disabilities if this really marginal thing, like you've got a wheelchair. No, disability is not being able to walk down the footpath without risking breaking your hip and dying 6 months later. You know, like we are not assuming that there is an increasing section of the community that are less abled than the people we plan our cities for. So I want to plan mobility for, like, if you like, a universal access solution, and it must assume that a lot of people do not drive.
Absolutely, and that also sort of leans into the livability ideas around aging in place and sort of the goals that we talk about there, which I think is a really nice way to sum up how parking really does impact everything. The way we're going to do the Q&A is I'm going to roam with a mic. Put up your hand when you do your question, introduce yourself, and ask away, and David will dispense wisdom, is what I was going to say. I was going to say dispense wisdom. Who has a question down here? You are the closest.
Hello, my name is Paul. I had a question about what we should do with the scourge of SUV uptake and massive Ford American-style trucks. How should we respond to that?
Yeah, you know, I got into trouble on this in the Guardian because I sort of, for a moment, I dropped my guard and I was talking about being pragmatic, and a few people sort of raised it with me. And I think, you know, at one level, I am a pragmatist. But the idea that Standards Australia are talking about reconfiguring like the standard for a car park, when you think about it, it's actually quite ridiculous. Car parks are built to a certain spec, and you just can't change that spec. It's built in, like, the same way that we built car parks in the 60s and 70s, and to some extent they entrenched the values of the 60s and 70s. They also entrenched assumptions about vehicles. We've got a whole bunch of car parks that are actually built to a very, very different mindset and a different vehicle, and those vehicles are more often under 1 tonne. So we've got people coming into these older car parks now with, and it's not just SUVs actually, it's actually also EVs, interestingly, they're particularly heavy. And when people were saying, oh, you're being quite hysterical, and I'm thinking, well, maybe not. You know, like in New York, they had a car park actually pancake collapse, and it killed several people. And then after that event, the city went out and reviewed all these older car parks, and there were quite a few that just were not understood. So there's a practical thing. And I also, I mean, I will spare you my sarcasm about people who feel the need to own these vehicles, because that will just be distracting. And at the end of the day, it's not actually really that satisfying. I just think we've got to stick to our guns. So we just cannot just keep giving people the parking that they want. If people in the city, I live at Kangaroo Island, and the people in Kangaroo Island do not drive these cars, even though they're farmers and we're out in the rural area. They don't drive those cars. Those idiots are living in the suburbs. All right, there is no reason at all. Oh, I've got a yacht. Really? A big deal. You know, there is no reason for people to drive the cars they have. And as planners, I think we've got to push back against this idea that they need more and more space to park their car. And God forbid, if we actually did go down that pathway, charge people for what they use, because that's what they tried to do in Vancouver. And sadly, it was defeated, that they were going to charge these larger vehicles an increased fee. But I'm sure, they might go back and have another crack at that, because I think there's an argument for that. Yeah.
There are two things on that. One, that the registration for a heavier vehicle in Melbourne is $1.20 more than a regular sized vehicle. So I'm sure that's paying for all the externalities, no problem. And the other thing is, if you want to dispense sarcasm, I can direct you to a tweet that went so viral that news.com.au wrote a story about it where I did the work for you. I'm going to hand over for our next question.
So I'm Angelica, and my question's about, I guess, when people have such an emotional, visceral reaction to even going anywhere near parking, how do you transform them into having a bit more of a logical viewpoint? Because we try with education, but there's also some people who don't want to listen as well.
Yeah.
And they're the decision makers.
That's a good question. Can I say that as I talk to people about parking, I have to really repress certain parts of my personality. There's a certain amount of pugilism that's been built into me, and I just think, don't do that. All right. So what I often say to people when people make really ridiculous comments, I say, I agree. All right, because you know what? There's a little bit of me that does. The driver in me, that selfish driver who's got to be able to park at the front door, that little bit of George Costanza, yes, I have that. So part of me does agree, and I say, I agree, but, all right, and then you've got to try and have that discussion. But look, it's always going to be difficult, because I think we view parking so intensely, like this territorial instinct is so powerful. It's hard work, but I do feel that as planners and elected members, just understanding the issue a little bit better and understand where people are coming from, that maybe we can, instead of hitting them head on, we can just sort of move around them a little bit and try and say, well, I get that you want your parking, but you still need places worth going to. Like, no one is going to your shop if your shop is just a dump, like if your place is just not worth visiting. So, maybe we have to try and be strategic about how we approach the issue. Yeah.
Wonderful. I believe we have another question just here.
Hi, my name is Nuno. Just touching on the first question, even more worrisome is that the Australian standards for car park design have been increased to accommodate those vehicles. So that's even more concerning. My question is, have you looked, or do you know if anyone has looked at on-demand buses and their impact on parking demand?
So just say the last section.
On-demand bus.
Oh, on-demand bus.
The impact on parking demand.
Look, honestly, I don't know. But I would argue that, just say if you're talking about park and ride, that it's quite interesting that if you want to have an extra bus service, suddenly the government can come up with all these figures to explain to you why that is not possible. But they always have money to justify parking. And I would argue that most of the time they have absolutely no justification at all for it. And I say, you know, like we because we don't often understand the cost of parking, we therefore are unable to evaluate the cost benefit. Like if you say we need to build up access to transit, well, there's more than one solution here. There's a whole bunch of solutions, all right? And as planners, we should be objectively evaluating all of those solutions. So even yesterday, I was heading out to a friend's place out near Coburg, and I thought, oh, they've resurfaced all this new car park. You know, how cool is that? You know, we can all go and park on that car parking. And yet still, you know, the walk up to the station, the bikeways are still rubbish. No one cares. So, you know, I just sort of feel that if we at least demand that government show us their homework, we might be able to maybe make a better decision about those transit services and those walking and cycling opportunities.
I know that one of the promises that the Victorian government made when they did their ministerial roundtable, which we were at, around the planning reforms, was that they were speaking about more transparency. So I think for anyone in the room who wants to advocate for specific transparency around parking costs, I think that's a really good move.
Hi David, my name's Bernadette. I am a councillor at Maribyrnong where the punch-on happened, but I wasn't in the room then, which is great. I just want to go to your question of your notion of entitlement, and if you look at any real estate ad, whether you're a renter or trying to buy a home, it champions the off-street parking in front of that house that you apparently own. So how do we get over this idea that I own the space out the front of my house?
I love this question because one of the things I was really intrigued by when I was in two cities, San Francisco and Vancouver, something that was not on my radar at all was residential parking permits. And as I was talking to people, and they were saying people assume that parking is an extension of their unit, like that's their entitlement. Almost without question, those schemes, they'll have 1,000 car parks and 3,000 permits. They're always a mess. Even in Stonington, like the first 2 permits cost you nothing, as if this whole scheme is just magically running itself, as if the land is off, as if all that curb space has no value, as if there's not a higher and better use for the curb, as if the significant number of people who live in that area wouldn't actually find some use for some green space or seating or mid-block curb build-outs. So, and when I was in Chicago and I was talking to some people there from the Parking Reform Network, and we were down at North Halsted, and we worked out that actually there were 40% less car parks than there were units. And the whole scheme was just an absolute dog's dinner. So the way forward that seems to be evolving from the best practice is they have grandfathered this really crazy old scheme for existing residents, but any new residents can't sign into that scheme. They actually have to pay a fee, which is deemed to be the actual cost of running that scheme. And then there's also sort of some interventions where they will start to give up some of that parking. So over quite a few years, the take-up, because people are actually paying the actual cost of the fee, the take-up hasn't been the same. Suddenly, we don't need all that junk in the garage. We can put a car in there instead. People are actually thinking, I don't want to pay this money. They will find another solution. So I know there is definitely that sense of entitlement is very, very strong. And I must sound like an absolute raving capitalist here, but I'm not. But I just don't think you can ignore the power of the market here. I think, you actually have to charge people what you can, find a mechanism for charging for parking, and be confident that will change people's behaviour.
Yeah, the number one way, I think, is incentives, and no better person to ask a question potentially about that, but maybe not.
Thanks, Jono. Thanks, David. Really, really interesting. My name's Joey. I'm from the Grattan Institute. I'm really interested in the trade-off you were illustrating between the attractiveness of a destination and its quantity of car parking. And it seems intuitively correct to me that that trade-off exists. But I suppose if I was to put myself in the shoes of, say, the CEO of Northland or some other big suburban shopping centre, I might argue that evidently I found a loophole to this trade-off. Because I've created an area where heaps of people come to visit, and there is ample car parking. So I suppose my question is, what do you think that means?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a little bit sneaky in my work that I try to not talk about suburban parking, mainly because I just think it is just a... All right. So I do say that as planners, when we build these very low density car dependent suburbs, that has critical implications for the inner city, because people are really pushed into this car ownership, and then we build these great big freeways, we're bringing all this traffic into the city. Each one of those cars is looking for a car park. It puts a huge amount of pressure on the inner city areas, and we've seen in the last sort of decades, particularly after the post-war period, where car parking policy was being weaponised against inner city communities, where you couldn't change a land use without providing parking. So pretty quickly we were demolishing buildings to make way for parking. In fact, there was a thing on television that not long ago about the loss of the historic Melbourne, and they never discussed parking. But for me, like, the whole thing about those minimum rates was absolutely critical to the loss of those buildings, because if your building didn't actually have a car park, there was a very good chance it was going to get demolished. Or the building next to it had a change of use. And the tax system similarly was actually making it quite easy for people to demolish these buildings. But back to the suburban centres though, I will say this. As a kid, I grew up in Brisbane, and just down the road from me was a shopping centre called Garden City. So these were all sort of like the early 1960s suburban shopping centres on these huge sites. And then gradually the shopping centre builds a new section and another section. They're cannibalising the car parking, all right? And then they're pushing the car parking underground, they're pushing the car parking on the roof, so the cost of parking is continually increasing. But in the minds of their clientele, the parking's all free, but it can't possibly be free. And in fact, year on year, the cost of parking to the developer is just really escalating, because they're landlocked, so they have to find these really expensive solutions. So I'm not sure that the shopping centre model, the suburban shopping centre models, are working that well. I think the whole thing about bricks and mortar being compromised by online shopping is very real. And I just say finally, when I was in Detroit, there was a shopping centre that was designed by a Viennese architect, famous 1950s guy, I can't remember his name, he'll come to me. Victor, help me out here, Victor, he'll come to... Thank you very much. Victor Gruen, right? So he was this European architect, and he had this idea: the shopping centres as these really beautiful, easy, walkable spaces. Just ignore the car parking around them. And North Lakes, how original, in Detroit was the very first shopping centre, and they closed that shopping centre for a few years ago because it just wasn't functioning. And would you believe that when the Detroit Council were bidding for the Amazon site, that was actually, the shopping centre was the site that they were inviting Jeff Bezos to set up his Amazon store on. And I thought, well, that's kind of the closing the circle. So I appreciate people make these great arguments about the suburban shopping, but I think it's highly problematic. Yeah.
Great.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm a councillor at the City of Yarra. I was interested in what you were saying about the parking minimums and just getting the state to just come in and make the change. One thing we've struggled with in Yarra is we're quite fortunate to have pockets of the population who are willing to see this kind of change. We've put up parking amendments ourselves to try to eliminate minimums or put in maximums, and we've actually found the state as a roadblock. Like in the past, they've said no, they haven't actually let us make that change ourselves. And I was just wondering if you had any ideas for people in this room about how they might help show the state that this is actually a popular policy or a worthwhile policy.
Well, I don't, we could all go and march down to, down the roads, bang on the doors. Their own people are calling for removal of minimums, right? Infrastructure Victoria, I read the stuff, you guys read the stuff, all right? YIMBY talk about that in their work. No one should have any doubt at all that this has to happen, but the government at some stage has just got to stop hiding under the table and deal with this. And quite frankly, I feel a bit sort of gnarly about this because, and I'm just thinking about the language I'm going to use here, but I'll say it. To talk about affordable housing and not deal with minimum rates is gutless, all right? There is no way you can properly deal with affordable housing and not deal with minimum rates. So they need to either stop bullshitting us or do something about it. Yep, yeah, that's, yeah.
So apparently they are, do you know more, sir? They are actually reviewing minimums. So now is probably the time to get in touch with your local member and find out how to feed into the process, because there is some consideration. I don't know the full parameters of it. This gentleman might know more.
Yeah, they're going to review the clause 5206, and that was going to be my question. I'm sorry if I jumped ahead of someone, but it's the million-dollar question. What would you do to change the current parking requirements for the state of Victoria?
Oh, well, I mean,
I know, in 50 words or less, I guess.
Look,
you could be here all night.
Okay, so you've heard me bang on about minimum rates. The other thing I like to bang on about is park and ride, because I have this sort of thing where we get the council, we get the government to do what it absolutely has got to do, which is deal with minimum rates. And there's some great models. Look at California, look at Oregon. You know, that absolutely has to happen. But what I'm hoping for, in a way, is that if we can get the government just to open the door a little bit on parking reform, we can start to have a discussion about park and ride. Because I think park and ride has just become this huge black money hole, and we're not asking any questions about it. And I just feel, I'm just constantly stunned that, and the federal government's got a role in this as well, because they've been cash splashing. You know, a few years ago in 2019, they were throwing around $660 million that amazingly ended up in all these marginal electorates, providing parking for people that already had quite a lot of parking. Interestingly, there were places like Kooyong where they were demolishing parking structures to build new parking structures, and car parks were regularly coming in at $100,000 plus per space, and it is absolutely nuts. But we're not questioning it. We just think, oh yeah, whatever. I would like the state government to publish all of the information they have on park and ride. How many park and rides do you have? How much is it costing the community? Like the land value, not the I'm going to zone this land down to absolutely nothing industrial, shithole land. Like zone it for its highest and best use. Zone it for like a transit-oriented development and value it accordingly. Okay, plus all the infrastructure layovers, plus all the traffic management stuff. Tell us what it costs and then tell us why. Justify why you can do that. And yet there are people around the city every day of the week that cannot access a rail system because we can't afford to provide DDA access onto a railway platform. I think that the government has to answer those questions. The thing is, we're just sort of so in the comfort zone about just doing the same old. But like I said earlier on, the technology, the need is there, the technology is there. We can be smarter about this. All right, so why don't we start doing that?
Perfect. I've had a hand over here. It's going to be our last question, so sorry to those who we weren't able to get to, and no pressure, but land the whole session, please.
Thank you. So just slightly picking up on the park and ride scheme. So I'm from Sydney originally, and I guess 8-10 years ago when the Northwest Metro was launched, a lot of the stations out there and the growth areas had park and rides around them. So that was one point I was thinking about. And then secondly, the question is, do some cities or states in this country do it better than others? Are some starting from a better position than others in terms of parking reform? And is there any way we can look to, other than outside Australia, for where we can get inspiration to make things better?
Well, I'm not sure there's any city that's actually doing it better. I think we just all do sort of variations on a theme, and I call it sort of planning by accident. I think a lot of park and ride came out of early 20th century decisions where railways were carrying freight, that freight got transferred onto trucks, but they had all this land. So instead of managing freight and having stables and barns and warehouses, it just got taken over by parking. I don't think there was any real sort of logic in it. But I'll say controversially that the city where I felt there was some light on the horizon was actually Los Angeles, and that might surprise a lot of people. What they did there, they brought in a very modest $3 a day charge for parking. And according to some people, that was the end of civilization. All right. So it's barely a rounding error on the value of the land. And sometimes we're talking about $3 a day for parking in structure near stations, and people were going berserk about it. But what it actually did was it pushed the parking demand, it nudged it back. So in places like North Hollywood, they've got on the Red Line, they've got the North Hollywood station. It is surrounded by just hectares of parking. And the government sort of hopped in there and thinking, oh, we've got a better use for this land. All right, so they're starting to nudge back. So I think it's dangerous if you're going to sort of go in there and straight off day one charge people what that parking's actually worth. But I think we need to find mechanisms. So even a modest fee can have quite a significant impact. I never thought I would be sitting up here telling everyone how great Los Angeles is, but there's definitely a lesson there.
And we thank you very much for it. Everyone, give a round of applause, please. Thank you so much, David. I think we could all talk about this for quite a while, but there's actually a scarcity of parking in this venue, and I think some people would like to sit down and some people would like to stand up. What we're going to do from here, so if I could get the next slide, please, my friend. Thank you all very much for coming. This has been a great discussion, of course, and where to from here? As has been signed, reform is happening right now as we speak, as we listen. The government is sort of coming in with ambitious planning reforms. As you know, Plan Melbourne was shooting for 70% infill. It hit about 46% infill development. That means that we had more than half the development happening on the urban fringe. The government has come in and said they're going to be quite aggressive about coming back and reclaiming what they weren't able to hit in the target over the last decade. Parking reform is part of that. There are a lot of mechanisms to pull on, and that is what, of course, we're focused on at YIMBY Melbourne. And this event, the first in a series of events, is going to be part of bringing forth those mechanisms for change, making them public, and making it clear that through people like you showing up, making it clear that there is absolutely an appetite for this. There's a popular appetite, and there's a popular understanding that better cities and bigger cities are possible. So, you can join us again in March, tentatively, Wednesday, March 13th, for our next event, Unbanning Beauty, where we're going to be looking at provisions within the planning code that are sort of restricting us from building the beautiful buildings that make cities around the world, and indeed a large part of older Melbourne, illegal to build nowadays. And that comes down to a lot of weird planning esoterica and also, in part, parking. So, in the meantime, please stay involved, become a member of YIMBY Melbourne, support our mission. We are, despite the aspersions cast upon us occasionally, 100% funded by our members to the tune of a $20 membership fee a year, $5 concession. That little support helps us make events like this happen. They don't obviously happen for free, but we are hugely thankful. And please, round of applause to Fringe Commons and Trades Hall. It's a wonderful space, and thank you all very much for joining. I've got a little name tag on here. A couple of my colleagues, Ethan and Don at the very least, have tags also, and there are many YIMBY Melbourne members and contributors scattered around these halls. So please stick around, have a drink, network. By the door, we will be selling these beautiful YIMBY Melbourne pins that Tom Pizzell up the back has designed and we are selling. They help us out a little bit. We make a little bit off them, and they're really beautiful. So those are at the door. Otherwise, the lounge is open. Out here is open. Please stick around, have a chat, come up, talk to us, talk to David. He's not done talking about parking, and neither are we. Thank you all very much.